In the summer of 1099, a column of exhausted, half-starved soldiers broke through the walls of Jerusalem and committed acts of slaughter that would echo in memory for 9 centuries. We remember the Crusades for their violence, and we are right to. But if we look only at the battlefield, we miss almost everything that actually mattered. Behind every siege was a ledger of trade. Behind every sermon calling men to die for Christ was a library, quietly being translated out of Arabic and into Latin. Behind every fortress wall was a marketplace, a customs house, a new way of thinking about money, kingship, and the self. This is not, in the end, a story about war. It is a story about what war, almost despite itself, built. Beyond the battlefield, how the Crusades reshaped European civilization. Act 1. The Sermon and the Spark. On the 27th of November, 1095, in a field outside the French town of Clermont, Pope Urban II rose before a crowd of bishops, knights, and common pilgrims and asked them to march to the other end of the known world. The immediate trigger was a request from Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, had been pushed onto the defensive by the Seljuk Turks and needed soldiers. He was thinking, most likely, of a few hundred mercenaries. What he received instead was a mass movement of tens of thousands of armed pilgrims, fired by Urban's promise that fighting for Jerusalem would wash away the penalty for sin. The crowd's response became legend: Deus vult. God wills it. Within 4 years, against almost every reasonable expectation, the army of the First Crusade had crossed Anatolia, starved its way through Syria, and taken Jerusalem by storm. What followed was not one war, but nearly 2 centuries of intermittent, overlapping conflict. The catastrophic Second Crusade of the 1140s, the Third Crusade, in which Richard the Lionheart and Saladin fought each other to an exhausted respect, the Fourth Crusade of 1204, which never reached the Holy Land at all, but instead sacked Constantinople, a fellow Christian capital, and a long tail of later expeditions that sputtered out with the fall of Acre, the last mainland Crusader stronghold, in 1291. For a long time, popular memory treated all of this as a single morality play, a clash of civilizations, east against west, cross against crescent. Modern historians see something more complicated. As Christopher Tyerman has argued in his major history of the movement, the Crusades are best understood not as one campaign, but as a recurring institution of medieval life, one that drew the Latin West into sustained, often violent, but deeply transformative contact with the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Jonathan Riley Smith made a similar point, that the crusading idea reshaped European society as much through its side effects, finance, migration, the movement of ideas, as through any military outcome on the ground. It is also worth pausing on who actually went. Religious zeal was real, but it traveled alongside far more practical motives. Younger sons, excluded by primogeniture from inheriting family land, saw the Crusader states as a chance to carve out a lordship of their own. Indebted nobles saw a church-granted reprieve from their creditors, since canon law protected a Crusader's property while he was away. Merchants saw new markets opening before the first sword was even drawn. The Crusades, in short, mobilized an entire society's surplus ambition, ordering it abroad. And that mobilization is precisely what makes their domestic consequences so far-reaching. So before we ask who won and who lost at Jerusalem, Antioch, or Acre, it is worth asking a different question. What did 200 years of contact actually leave behind once the swords were sheathed? Act 2. Engines of Commerce. The Crusades needed ships, and the ships belonged to Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. These Italian maritime republics transported armies, supplied them, and in return extracted trading privileges in the new Crusader port cities of Acre, Tyre, and Antioch. Entire merchant quarters, tax exemptions, and warehouses granted in exchange for naval support. What had been a modest regional trade became, within a few decades, a permanent commercial infrastructure linking the Mediterranean's eastern and western shores. Through that infrastructure flowed goods that simply had no Western equivalent: refined cane sugar, which Crusaders encountered being processed on plantations in the Levant, and which European apothecaries initially sold by the ounce as medicine, new dyes and finished textiles, including the heavy patterned cloth that took its name from Damascus, damask, and the fine cotton associated with Mosul, which English still calls muslin. Glassware of a clarity Europe could not yet produce. And, threading through everything, the spice trade, pepper, cinnamon, and nutmeg arriving via Levantine and Egyptian intermediaries from a wider Indian Ocean network that most Europeans could not even have located on a map. Financing all of this, and financing the staggering cost of moving armies thousands of miles for years at a time, forced equally significant changes. The economic historian Robert Lopez described this period as nothing less than a commercial revolution, arguing that the demands of long-distance crusade logistics accelerated the development of credit instruments, maritime insurance, and partnership contracts that would become the basic architecture of later European capitalism. The Knights Templar, founded to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, ended up running something closer to an international bank. A noble traveling from Paris to Acre could deposit funds at a Templar preceptory in France and withdraw the equivalent sum, minus a fee, in the Levant. A letter of credit system centuries ahead of its time, built not by merchants but by monks who happened to also be soldiers. None of this was the intended purpose of the Crusades. Nobody set out from Clermont in 1095 to build a banking network or a sugar trade. But war, it turns out, is an extraordinarily effective forcing function for commercial innovation. And Europe's merchants and financiers absorbed that lesson long after the last Crusader castle had fallen. Tellingly, the trade itself outlived the political project that launched it. When Acre finally fell in 1291 and the last mainland Crusader state collapsed, Venetian and Genoese merchants did not pack up and go home. They simply renegotiated terms with the victorious Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and kept the spice and textile routes running. The military crusade had failed completely. The commercial revolution it set in motion had become permanent, self-sustaining, and entirely indifferent to who held Jerusalem. Act 3, Bridges of the Mind. It is tempting to imagine the Crusader states themselves, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, as the great bridge over which Greek and Arabic learning crossed into Latin Europe. The truth is more modest and more interesting. Most historians now locate the real centers of translation elsewhere. In Sicily, where Norman kings ruled over a population that was Greek, Arabic, and Latin all at once, and above all in Toledo, in Christian Spain, where scholars systematically rendered Arabic philosophical and scientific texts into Latin throughout the 12th century. The Crusades did not create this transmission, but they widened the field of contact in which it occurred, and they kept Western Europe's attention fixed, decade after decade, on a Mediterranean world it had previously regarded as remote. What moved along these routes was extraordinary. Aristotle, largely lost to the Latin West for centuries, returned via Arabic commentary and translation. The medical writings of Galen arrived filtered and expanded through the work of Ibn Sina, known to Latin readers as Avicenna. The philosophical commentaries of Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes, became so influential in European universities that Averroist was, for a time, practically a school of thought in its own right. This flood of newly available material is one of the central preconditions for the rise of scholasticism and for the founding of the first universities. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, in the 12th and 13th centuries. Inside the Crusader states themselves, contact produced something quieter, but no less revealing. Genuine curiosity between enemies. The Damascene nobleman Usama ibn Munkid, who fought against the Franks for decades, also wrote at length in his memoirs about individual crusaders he came to know and even respect, describing a long-settled Frankish knight's manners as markedly different from those of the recently arrived. The chronicler William of Tyre, Archbishop of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and one of the era's finest historians, reportedly learned Arabic and drew on Islamic historical sources for his own account of the Crusades, a Latin churchman treating Muslim historiography as a source worth consulting, not merely an enemy's propaganda. None of this erased the hostility that defined the period. Usama and William both wrote within a world of ongoing war. But it shows that even at the height of religious conflict, The border between civilizations was porous in ways the battlefield narrative tends to flatten out. There was a quieter, more technical legacy too. Geography itself improved. 2 centuries of pilgrims, merchants, and soldiers moving repeatedly across the eastern Mediterranean generated a volume of practical navigational knowledge that fed into the Portolan charts produced by Italian cartographers from the late 13th century onward. The first maps in European history accurate enough to actually sail by. A continent that had spent its early medieval centuries with only the haziest sense of what lay beyond its own coastline ended the crusading era with a working, if still incomplete, picture of the wider Mediterranean world, a foundation later explorers would build directly upon. Act 4, the reshaping of power. Crusading was ruinously expensive, and that expense did more to reshape European political power than any single battle. In 1188, King Henry II of England imposed the so-called Saladin tithe, a direct tax on income and movable property levied across his entire realm to fund crusading. It was a strange and unpopular innovation, but it set a precedent. The king's right to tax his subjects directly, rather than simply calling on feudal lords for a fixed quota of knights, edged forward by one significant step. Historians such as Norman Housley have traced how the financial demands of repeated crusading campaigns pushed European monarchies toward exactly this kind of centralized taxation, an essential building block of the early modern state. The lesser nobility paid an even steeper price. Mounting an expedition to the Holy Land meant outfitting oneself, one's household, and one's retainers for a journey that might last years and very often ended in death far from home. Many lords sold or mortgaged their lands to finance the journey. Many family lines simply died out in Syria or Egypt, their estates reverting by default to the crown or the church. Piece by piece, the old feudal patchwork of semi-independent local lords gave ground to more centralized royal authority. Not because kings defeated their nobles in battle, but because the nobles bankrupted themselves on crusade. Out of this same pressure came an entirely new kind of institution, the military order. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller fused the monastic vow with the soldier's sword, creating organizations that were simultaneously religious, military, and, as we have seen, financial. Their independence and accumulated wealth eventually made them a target rather than an asset. In October 1307, King Philip IV of France had the Templars across his kingdom arrested in a single coordinated dawn raid, seized their assets, and within 7 years had the order formally suppressed by the papacy. It was, among other things, a demonstration that a sufficiently determined monarch could now move directly against an institution that answered in theory only to the Pope. An early sign of the balance of power, tilting from church to crown, that would define the centuries to come. The Crusades, in other words, were waged in the name of Christendom as a single unified Christian world. Their long-term effect was very nearly the opposite. They helped accelerate the rise of the separate, centralized, tax-collecting national monarchies that would eventually displace that unified vision altogether. The papacy itself paid a price for this, ironically enough, given that it had launched the entire project. Each failed expedition after the triumph of 1099, and most of them failed, chipped away at the credibility of papal calls to arms. By the early 14th century, with the crusading movement effectively spent and the Templars dismantled at a French king's command, the papacy's claim to stand above secular monarchs as the supreme arbiter of Christendom looked considerably weaker than it had a century before. Within a few years, the papal court itself would relocate to Avignon, operating for decades under heavy French influence, a striking measure of how far the balance of power had shifted. Act 5, Stone, Song, and the Shape of the Other. Walk the walls of Caernarfon Castle in North Wales, built for Edward I in the 1280s, and you are looking, whether you know it or not, at the Crusades. Edward had campaigned in the Holy Land in his youth and studied the great concentric fortifications of the Crusader states. Above all, the Hospitaller stronghold of Crac des Chevaliers in modern Syria, with its double ring of walls, each higher than the one before. The castle-building techniques he brought home reshaped military architecture across Britain. Literature absorbed the encounter just as deeply, if more ambiguously. The Chanson de Geste, The great heroic poems of medieval France, such as the Song of Roland, drew much of their dramatic energy from imagined combat against a Muslim Saracen enemy, even when, as with Roland, the actual historical battle being mythologized had nothing to do with the Crusades at all. Meanwhile, some scholars have argued, more controversially, that the troubadour poetry of southern France, with its elaborate codes of courtly love, owed a debt to Andalusian and Arabic poetic traditions encountered through contact across the Mediterranean and the Iberian frontier. The evidence here is genuinely contested, and historians remain divided on how direct that influence was. What is less contested is the deeper cultural shift, an entire literary and religious vocabulary in which Christendom was imagined as a single embattled community defined against an external, often deliberately caricatured, Muslim other. The literary critic Edward Said, writing centuries later, would call the long afterlife of this habit of mind Orientalism, a Western tendency to construct the East as an exotic, monolithic, fundamentally different civilization, more useful as a mirror for Europe's own self-image than as an accurate description of anyone actually living there. Said's argument was about the modern era, but its roots reach back, in no small part, to exactly the imaginative work the Crusades performed, giving Europe a sharply defined outside against which to define its own, equally constructed inside. The Fourth Crusade left an unusually literal trace of this exchange. When crusading knights sacked Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city, not a Muslim one, they shipped home an enormous quantity of Byzantine treasure, relics, gold, and above all, art. The 4 bronze horses now standing above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica in Venice were looted directly from the Hippodrome of Constantinople in that sack. Byzantine icon painting, with its distinctive gold backgrounds and formal, otherworldly figures, flowed westward in the same current and left a visible mark on Italian devotional art in the decades that followed. Proof that even Europe's most shameful crusader episode, an attack on fellow Christians, fed directly into its own visual culture. Here, then, is the paradox at the center of the story. The Crusades were launched to unify Christendom against an external threat, fought in the name of a single faith and a single civilization. What they actually produced over 2 centuries was internal transformation on almost every axis that matters. New commercial and financial institutions, a flood of recovered and newly translated learning that fed directly into the rise of the university, centralized taxation and the slow erosion of feudal power in favor of the crown, new architecture, new literature, and a hardened sense of cultural identity that would shape Europe's self-understanding for centuries afterward. It is not too much to say that the Europe which would eventually produce the Renaissance, wealthier, more urbanized, newly hungry for classical learning, governed by increasingly centralized monarchies rather than a patchwork of feudal lords, was in significant part an unintended byproduct of 200 years spent trying and failing to hold Jerusalem. None of this justifies the violence of the campaigns themselves, the massacres at Jerusalem and elsewhere, or the immense suffering inflicted on Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian communities alike. But it does suggest that we have been asking the wrong central question, not simply who won the Crusades, but what, in the long and costly process of fighting them, Europe became. If you found this exploration valuable, consider subscribing to Lipar for more journeys through world history and philosophy. And let me know in the comments which encounter between civilizations you would like to see examined next.